Okay. All right, so let me move this out of the way. Can you all see the screen share? No,
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
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 I'm actually, this is actually blocking me and I can't figure out how to get it.
Hmm.
All right. Okay. So this class is Rivers of Maryland, and this is the introductory class. And I call it Thinking About Rivers. We're going to have a sort of a general talk about rivers and a look at Maryland in general, and then we will go to different parts of Maryland and look at their rivers. And this is, no, hang on. Welcome, okay. This is the class schedule. This is week 1, obviously, and then next week we will be looking at the Eastern Shore and then the rivers around Baltimore. We'll do a whole week on the Patapsco, and we will have a special guest speaker for part of that. Then we'll be looking at, we'll spend a whole week on the Patuxent, which is the longest river in Maryland, entirely within Maryland. Week 6 will be what I call the rivers that Maryland shares with other states. And the big ones are the Susquehanna and the Potomac. And then the final week will be rivers of Western Maryland, way out there in Garrett County. So that is the schedule. And I will probably send it out with my next email, just so people know about it. Also, a logistical little detail. Mary Lee Hillgartner has very generously volunteered to monitor the chat box. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. And I'll be stopping from time to time during the course of the class to look at the chat box, to have Mary Lee look at the chat box and try and answer your questions. So let us start with a definition. Whoops, going the wrong way. Okay,
Wrong way.
okay,
There you go.
there we are. So let's start with a definition. And this is one I found somewhere. What is a river? Oh, this is, and you can see that the kind of the basic things about a river is it's a natural stream of water, although we'll be talking about a couple of artificial rivers, i.e. canals, of which Maryland has 2, or used to have 2, now it has 1. It's fairly large. It flows in a definite channel. It flows downhill because water flows downhill. And I remember in the course of a job I was doing, reviewing site plans for developments, the guy I was working for said, the first thing you need to remember when you're looking at anything like this, Judy, is that water flows downhill. So, and then it flows to an outlet. Could, in the case of Maryland, it's often the Chesapeake Bay. And it usually gets wider as it's joined by tributary streams. So that gives you some sense of what a river is. What's the difference between a river and a stream or a creek? Well, these are not exact terms, but a river is generally wider and it tends to be navigable, at least for part of its length. And a stream or a creek is usually a tributary to a river. Maryland has various terms for streams, including creek, run, and falls. And falls is one I had not encountered before I moved to Maryland. There is a river on the Eastern Shore called the Corsica River, and it was originally called Corsica Creek. It was renamed the Corsica River by an act of the Maryland General Assembly, presumably the local people wanted to live next to something more important than a creek. So a river has many uses. People use rivers in many ways. They use them for transportation. It also creates a barrier to transportation. It's a source of what I call usable water, drinking, irrigation, industry, including cooling. It's used for generating power, and we'll see a lot of that in Maryland. It's a habitat for fish and other forms of aquatic life. It's a place to dump wastes, and we'll see how that works. And it's also for recreation. People use rivers for fishing, boating, swimming, hiking along, and just looking at, enjoying the scenery. And as you may have noticed, some of these uses are incompatible with one another. For example, sewage disposal and recreation, or sewage disposal and drinking water. In some cultures, rivers are used for religious ceremonies, although not so much in this country. And the world's earliest civilizations developed in three major river valleys: the Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East, the Indus in India and Pakistan, and the Yellow River in China. So how big a part are rivers of the world's total water? Well, the answer is not much. 97% of the world's waters are in the oceans. About 2% are locked up in the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, although these are starting to melt, with some concern about that. And that's 99%. So the remaining 1% is liquid fresh water, which includes groundwater, but of that, only 1/10 or 0.1% of the world's waters are surface waters, which includes rivers, lakes, ponds, and streams, and so forth. So this is a very small part of the total water in the world, but it's very important because we use it so much. And the water, the surface water, including the ocean water, is in constant circulation. The circulation system is known as the hydrologic cycle, which has been described as a planetary scale distillery powered by solar energy. So this diagram shows how the cycle works. Water evaporates from the ocean. Whoops. I'm trying to get my cursor here. Here we go. I don't know if you can see it. It evaporates from the ocean into clouds. The clouds move across to the land. Water falls out from the clouds in the form of rain or snow. Then it runs off over land or percolates into the ground. And this cross section shows where groundwater is down here. And then, or if it flows directly into surface waters like streams and rivers, then that flows back into the ocean, and the groundwater as well flows back into the ocean. So this is constantly moving around the water cycle. And a river is also part of a watershed, and we're going to see some watersheds in Maryland. It's a channel at the low point of the watershed. It collects water runoff from all the land in the watershed and carries it downstream to the outlet, the Chesapeake Bay or whatever the outlet is. And here we have the same hydrologic cycle taking place, the rain falling into the river going back down into the ocean eventually. A watershed is defined as all the land that drains into a stream, river, or other body of water. And another term for a watershed is a drainage basin. And the boundary between two watersheds is the top of the ridge that divides it from the next watershed over. And in this diagram, it's called the watershed divide. Would be the highest points on either side of the river. So everyone lives in a watershed. And if we were in Fourier Hall today, we would be in the watershed of the Jones Falls, which runs to the Patapsco River, which in turn goes to the Chesapeake Bay, which in turn goes to the Atlantic Ocean. You might be living in a different watershed, and you can figure this out by thinking about the stream that's closest to your house and where it goes. Also, a small watershed, like the Jones Falls, may be part of a larger watershed, like the Patapsco, until you have a mega watershed that drains to an ocean. And there are 3 of these mega watersheds in the United States. There's the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, which is the Mississippi River watershed, and the Pacific Ocean. And that's where the water goes in this country. Now, to look at Maryland, this is a map of, they call it rivers, creeks, lakes, and bays of Maryland. And as you can see, Maryland has a lot of surface water. Every part of Maryland has rivers and creeks, and along the eastern shore, many different bays and inlets. Along both sides of the Chesapeake Bay. Most of Maryland's rivers drain to the bay, either directly or to other rivers that go to the Chesapeake. The biggest one is the Potomac, and the entire southern boundary from the bay to the west is the Potomac River. And this is the Potomac. Follows all along here, and then it drains at the mouth at the foot of St. Mary's County down here into the bay. So all of these rivers in Western Maryland and Frederick County and Southern Maryland drain to the Potomac and eventually to the bay. There's only one. There are 2 exceptions to this. Okay. One is the very northwestern corner of the state, and there are 2 rivers here that actually drain northward to the north instead of to the south, eventually to the Ohio River, and from there to the Mississippi River. So this tiny little corner of Maryland is part of the Mississippi River drainage. There are also a few rivers that drain directly either to the ocean or to the bays down near near Ocean City, rather, that do not drain to the bay, but drain directly or indirectly to the ocean itself. So what a river looks like and how it behaves depends on the local geology, the topography. They can be wide, slow moving, and deep, like many of the rivers on the eastern shore, or they can be shallow and fast moving, like rivers in Western Maryland. So now we're going to take a look at Maryland's geology. This is a map of what geologists call the geologic provinces of Maryland, areas that share a geology and that are different from adjoining areas. And geologists have mapped 5 distinct geological provinces, and the rivers of each one have different characteristics. So from east to west, there is the Atlantic coastal plain along both sides of the bay, the Piedmont, which means foothills, basically. The Blue Ridge, a narrow little chain of mountains. The Ridge and Valley Province, with Hagerstown in the middle. And at the far west, the Appalachian Plateau. The coastal plain includes all the counties of the Eastern Shore and the eastern portions of Hartford and Baltimore, and what we call Southern Maryland, Anne Arundel County, Charles, Calvert, St. Mary's, and part of Prince George's County, and also a part of Washington, D.C., which is here. This little square is Washington. Not exactly a square, but okay. So the land surface on the coastal plain is relatively flat, and the underlying geology is what's called unconsolidated sands and gravel. In other words, it's not bedrock. The rivers of this area are tidal in their lower portions. The tides rise and fall as the bay does. And the tidal portions are sometimes known as estuaries, and the water is somewhat salty. It's not as salty as the ocean, but it's what is known as brackish water. Uphill from the coastal plain is the Piedmont, and this includes most of Hartford County, part of Cecil, most of Baltimore County, all of Carroll County, almost all of Howard County, and Montgomery County, and the eastern part of Frederick County. And the topography of the Piedmont is rolling hills, and there is bedrock not far below the surface. The line, the boundary between the coastal plain and the Piedmont, is called the fall line, shown on the map here in this red line. And the fall line is a place where there is a sudden drop in topography because the bedrock of the Piedmont does not erode as fast as the sands and gravels of the coastal plain. So what you get is waterfalls basically all along this line, and they have been used for power. And we'll see some of that to building mills to use this water power. The fall line also tends to be what's called the head of navigation. When you navigate up the river in ocean-going ships, that is where you have to stop. So because of these two factors, cities have been built along the fall line. Among them are Trenton, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore. As you can see, the fall line goes right through the city, Washington, and Richmond. And then, of course, the cities all being there, roads were built to connect them. And so the fall line is more or less, follows, or I should say, the roads follow the fall line, US 1, and then later on I-95. Going west from the Piedmont, you come to the Blue Ridge. And if you drive west toward Frederick on Route 70, at some point you will see bluish looking hills in the distance, and that is the Blue Ridge. In Maryland, this is only about 10 miles wide, although it's much wider in Virginia. And then west, the second mountain province is the Ridge and Valley Province. This is Washington County and part of Allegheny County. And the eastern portion is known as the Great Valley. This goes north into Pennsylvania and south into Virginia. And in Maryland, it's called the Hagerstown Valley. Then the western portion of this province is a series of parallel ridges and narrow valleys between them. And the rivers here follow the valleys and drain to the Potomac River. And let's see, we'll go back, and you can see out here that all these rivers go north-south and drain into the Potomac. The westernmost part of Maryland is the Allegheny or Appalachian Plateau, which includes all of Garrett County and part of Allegheny County. It's a high plateau with steep-sided valleys, and it has the highest point in Maryland, which is at the southern end of Backbone Mountain in the southwestern corner of the state, around here. And the elevation of Backbone Mountain is 3,360 feet, which is high for Maryland, but not high compared to, say, the Rocky Mountains. And as I mentioned, this province also has the two rivers that flow north into the Ohio and eventually Mississippi River. So there are a couple of different river types in Maryland, and they are determined by the underlying geology. Dendritic river patterns, which means tree, and it kind of looks like a tree branches. Typically, these are the rivers of the coastal plain, the Piedmont, and the Allegheny Plateau. And when this type of river is dammed up to create a reservoir, the reservoir has a similar shape with its arms formed by the water backing up into the tributaries. And you can see this in this picture of what Loch Raven Reservoir, which is, the shapes, of course, are not as neat, but it's definitely a dendritic pattern. The other type of river is called a trellis pattern. And this is what you see in the Ridge and Valley province, where the narrow valleys force the rivers into this trellis pattern. So the rivers are parallel to one another. Now let's look at the names of the rivers in Maryland. Most of them are Native American names, and the local languages are mostly in the Algonquin family language of Native American languages. And rivers often have Native American names, presumably because when the settlers got here, the people they met already had a name for the river, so they just adopted the same name. Unlike, say, town names where the colonists created the town and gave it their name, like Baltimore. I have found translations of some of these river names, mostly from a book by someone named Hamel Kenny, although there are other sources that don't necessarily agree with him. So this is not solid information. So for instance, Patapsco either means tide water covered with froth or backwater. Patuxent either means small waterfall or where salty and fresh water meet, which certainly describes the lower Patuxent River because it is tidal as far up as Bowie. Pocomoke was traditionally translated as dark water because of its dark color. But according to recent scholarship in these languages, it means something like broken ground. And they think it might have to do with the kind of agriculture that was practiced in the area. Choptank is translated as it flows back strongly. This is probably referring to the tidal movement in the river. Nanticoke means tidewater people, probably referring to the Nanticoke tribe that lived there. Potomac is where goods are brought in, and they think this might refer to a local trade either in bison skins or soapstone. And Susquehanna means smooth flowing stream. There are other Native American names of Maryland rivers, Wicomico, of which there are two, one on the eastern shore and one on the southern Maryland. The Anamessics, the Manikin, the Monocacy, and the Yakiogani, or the Yak, as people refer to it. So before we go on, I will ask Mary Lee if there are any questions.
Nope, there's no questions, Judy.
Okay, thank
You're
you.
doing Doing a good job.
And just to repeat, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and Mary Lee will be monitoring the chat. And we'll stop from time to time to look at it. So some of the things we use rivers for, as we mentioned, were transportation, food, power generation, water supply, recreation, and waste disposal. So before we go on, let's look at who has the right to use a river, who has the legal right to the water. And the word riparian means having to do with rivers. So according to Maryland law, beyond the mean high water mark under normal ebb and flow, waters are public. But owners who border a navigable body of water have the common law right to make a landing, wharf, or pier for their own or public use. In the eastern part of the country, the right to actually take water out of a river for irrigation is not a big issue. But in the West, where virtually all agriculture has to be irrigated, it's a major legal issue and it has very complex regulations. Generally, riparian rights don't include the right to divert water and make it unavailable to downstream users. But in 1669, Maryland passed the Maryland Mill Act. And this was just about 40 years after the colony was founded. They decided there weren't enough mills being built. They were important for the economy and they wanted to make it easier. So the Maryland Mill Act provided that anyone wishing to operate a mill could get an 80-year lease on 10 acres of land, where it's suitable for building a mill, where there was flowing water, preferably near a waterfall. But it also provided that any injury to riparian landowners would be subject to damages that could be awarded by a jury. So it wasn't a right to do anything you wanted, but it was to encourage mill building. Also, the right to fish in a river is regulated by the state, which if you're a fisherman, you probably know all this. They set the maximum size on catches, the minimum size for catching certain fish, so that the juveniles are left to propagate. They set dates for fishing seasons, and sometimes they will impose a total ban on catching a certain species where stocks are declining, and they want to regenerate the fish stocks. That has happened in the past. Also, since the 1970s and the beginning of the environmental movement, we have had regulations about what you can dump into a river. We started to realize that the capacity of our environmental systems are not unlimited. So now let's look specifically at some of the uses for rivers. A river is a transportation artery. It is used for moving freight. Before we had good roads and railroads in this country, rivers were the primary mode of transportation. And the first areas that Europeans settled would be areas that were accessible by river. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, on the Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland, tobacco plantations were the main economy. They shipped their products to market by water, often from their own docks along the bay's tidal rivers. And you will still see roads in this area that have the words landing, wharf, or ferry in the name, indicating that the road once led to a local wharf. As I said, tobacco was the main cash crop at this time, And a hogshead was how they shipped it. It was a standardized barrel size. It was 40 inches tall, 30 inches in diameter, and holding about 1,000 pounds of tobacco. And if you look at the people in this picture, you can see how things worked in those days. The people that did the work were most likely enslaved African Americans. And the gentleman in the hat and the coat and the breeches is checking the inventory. He might be the ship's captain. Towns along the rivers were often built at the head of navigation, the place where a river then became too shallow for the draft of ocean-going boats. And when we look at the Eastern Shore next week, we'll see a number of examples of this. But on the Western Shore, the head of navigation was usually at the fall line. So it became a transportation break point where you would have to offload goods from a ship to some other means of transportation to take them further inland. As the surrounding woodlands were cut over and plowed under, they created runoff and sedimentation, and some rivers eventually silted up. So there are a few towns in Maryland that were once busy ports, but are now just backwaters because the waters are no longer navigable. One of them is Port Tobacco in Charles County. It was an important port in the 18th century, and that's where the name comes from. And it's now just a small town on the banks of a creek. Some other former port towns whose rivers have silted up are Joppa on the Gunpowder River in Harford County and Elk Ridge Landing on the Patapsco, which isn't even there anymore, but it's near the current town of Elk Ridge. We'll talk about that later when we look at the Patapsco. So rivers were used for moving freight, and they were also used for moving people. And this is not a river, it's a canal, but it has the same function. And it is built to transport freight and passengers, and the boats were pulled by mules. And we'll be looking later on at the two canals that were built in Maryland, the Chesapeake in Ohio, which is where this picture was taken, along the Potomac, and the Chesapeake in Delaware in Cecil County, which is still a very active and busy canal. They were used for shipping freight and passenger travel, as were the rivers. And this is a picture of a packet boat, which is basically a boat that carried passengers and freight and ran on a regular schedule. So this was public transportation in the days of rivers. Another way to travel on rivers and the bay was by steamboat. And this is a typical bay steamboat. And we'll be talking about steamboat travel more when we look at the Patuxent River. And also rivers sometimes have natural harbors at their lower ends where they're wide and deep and tidal. And of course, the most important harbor in Maryland was the mouth of the Patapsco, which we now call Baltimore Harbor. And it has been a port since the 18th century as the harbor for Baltimore City and beyond. So rivers are used for transportation, but they're also barriers to transportation. So the earliest river crossings would be either by foot or horseback in places where a river was shallow enough to be forded, and sometimes where it was deeper by boat. And these were ferries. In the colonial days, ferries were very common, and there are still a few left in Maryland, and this is one of them. This goes from Oxford on the Eastern Shore to Bellevue on the Eastern Shore. The ferry trip is 1.5 miles, but if you drive from Oxford to Bellevue, it is a 20-mile trip. So this is a ferry that is useful and still used. Later on, they built bridges. Some of them were short, like this one. This is crossing the Blackwater River on the eastern shore. And sometimes they were long, like the Bay Bridge built in 1952 to connect the eastern and western shores, which before that, you either had to drive all the way around through Cecil County or take a ferry. In the 1990s, Maryland and the Federal Highway Administration made an inventory of the state's historic bridges. They identified 855 of them, and 415 were put on the National Register of Historic Places. And this is one of them. Many of them were covered bridges in those days. This one is in Cecil County near Elkton, and it was built around 1860. And because rivers are barriers, they're also often boundaries. Sometimes they're boundaries between counties, and we'll see quite a few of those in Maryland. Sometimes between states, like the Potomac, and sometimes between countries. And in the United States, we have the Rio Grande, which is the border between the US and Mexico. So rivers can be routes, transportation routes and barriers to transportation, but a river is also a habitat, an ecosystem, meaning a habitat for plants and animals. Excuse me. The plant and animal life in a river depends on a number of factors: the depth of the river, the velocity of the current, the water temperature, the substrate, which is the term for what's on the bottom of the river, nutrients in the water, and suspended materials such as sediment and chemical and biological pollutants that are found in the water. And very important, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, which supports plant and animal life. And this is a fish found in clean streams. It's a kind of canary in the coal mine because they are so sensitive to environmental conditions. They only live in streams that are relatively free of sediment and pollution and high in dissolved oxygen. In Maryland, brook trout are found in streams in northern Baltimore County, the Catoctin Mountains, Garrett County, and the Upper Potomac. So these are relatively far away from developed areas. Sometimes a fish is also used as a food source. And this fish was particularly important in the colonial era, when it was, first of all, extremely abundant. And also it is anadromous. And anadromous means a fish that spawns in freshwater streams, then grows to a certain size, swims out to the ocean, where it lives until it's mature and ready to spawn, and then comes back to the waters where it's been hatched. This is one of nature's amazing feats. The best known fish of this kind are salmon, but they are not so much in Maryland as in New England and the Pacific Northwest. But because anadromous fish have a specific time of year when they start to swim upstream to spawn, they are then readily available for both recreational and commercial fishing. And shad, as I always like to put in the Latin name for plants and animals, because that's how you reference them if you really want to do any research on them. And Alosa sapidissima means more or less very delicious herring. It's in the herring family, and if you've ever eaten shad, you will know why it is called sapidissima. Quite good. This is a species found in Maryland that is semi-anadromous, meaning they spawn in freshwater streams, then they swim out to brackish water, partly salty, in this case, the Chesapeake Bay, where they mature, and then they return to their home rivers to spawn. And fish in this category in Maryland include striped bass, which we also locally call rockfish, although striped bass is very common up and down the eastern seaboard. Alewives, a kind of herring, blueback herring, and yellow perch. And we'll hear more about yellow perch when we talk about the Eastern Shore rivers. Here is a species of fish in Maryland with a life cycle that works in reverse. This is a fish that spawns in the ocean, swims into freshwater streams to mature, and then returns to the ocean to spawn. And they are called catadromous as opposed to anadromous. And the American eel can be found in Maryland rivers and the bay, and when it is not out in the middle of the ocean spawning. So species eaten as seafood, of course, are also found in rivers close to the Chesapeake Bay, as well as the bay itself. And I'm sure you're all familiar with crabs. And oysters are another important seafood that is not as abundant as it used to be, but they're working on that. So I'm going to stop here again. Mary Lee, any questions? Mary Lee?
Yes, we do. I just had to unmute myself.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
You have one question and one comment.
Okay.
Terry asked, Terry Lau,
Yeah.
does the Susquehanna have equal amounts of water flow as the Potomac?
That is an interesting question, and I will have to get back to you on that next week because I don't know the answer.
Okay, and then this is a comment from Deborah. Mill sites often need space for a dam, mill pond, and head and tail races
That's
because, okay, because many mill sites do not have sufficient head in the natural stream channel.
yeah, that's true. That's typically how a mill is built. And we'll see some of that later on. But yeah, a mill is not just a mill. It's a whole water flow system. Yeah.
Judy, can I ask a question? Because I sent it and somehow it didn't go through to you.
Sure.
Are you saying, I have a couple, are you saying that rivers, when they're silted up, when they get silted up, the towns go from dynamic to less busy and significant?
Yeah,
Is that what
because
happens?
they can no longer function as ports.
Okay,
These towns were busy ocean, ports that served ocean going ships. And once the ships can't get there anymore because the river's too shallow,
okay,
lose that function, and they
thank you.
sometimes disappear completely and sometimes just become small towns.
Okay, I have two more things. Are a brook and a stream the same thing?
Yeah, these are very vague terms. Yeah. So creek, brook, stream are just different words for something that's less than a river and usually tributary to a river.
Thank you. And the third thing is I find it really difficult to write a question without missing what you're telling, missing the lesson. I was wondering, could you just repeat the main point about canals? Because as I was writing, I didn't hear what you were saying.
Oh, well, I mean, a canal is just basically, we're going to talk about canals more. I didn't say much about them, just that right at this point, I just mentioned that there are two canals in Maryland, one of which is no longer used as a canal, the C&O along the Potomac, and the Chesapeake and Delaware is an active canal on the Eastern Shore. And we'll be talking about both of those when we get to those parts of Maryland.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And, if anybody has the same problem that Debbie had, feel free to raise your hand when we get to a question period, and, we can do it that way too. Okay, so going on from some of the inhabitants of the rivers to rivers as a water supply. There are several rivers in Maryland that are used to store and supply public water. The gun, I'm going to try and speed up a little. I have a feeling we're we're falling behind. I want to get through all this. The Gunpowder and the North Branch of the Patapsco are Baltimore's rivers, and Liberty Reservoir is on the North Branch of the Patapsco, and Pretty Boy and Lock Raven are on the Gunpowder. And we'll talk about the water supply system more in a couple of weeks. The Patuxent River feeds the reservoirs that provide water from Montgomery and Prince George's County. And there are two of those, Triadelphia and Rocky Gorge. And we will be looking at these in more detail when we talk about the Patuxent. So, river is a source of water power. And this is a typical looking mill from the old days, as I call it. The water flowing downhill releases gravitational energy that turns the mill wheels. This is on a small stream that flows into the Potomac. It's near Williamsport, Maryland, and it's now inside the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Park. So this was an early form of generation using water. And it was, as Debbie said, I don't have a diagram here, but I'll try and find one maybe for next week, of turn machinery for processes such as grinding flour, sawing wood, and weaving textiles. And the largest mills tended to be located on the fall line. The Patapsco, Gwynns Falls, Jones Falls, and Patuxent all had important mill sites along the fall line. And this would have been a grist mill to grind wheat and corn. And these were common along many creeks and streams in the area. And if you come across a road that has mill in the name, like Milford Mill or Paper Mill Road, they were roads that led to a mill. But nowadays, flowing water is used to turn turbines and generate hydroelectricity. And there are two major hydroelectric dams in Maryland. This is Conowingo on the Susquehanna, and there is one on Deep Creek Lake in Garrett County on Deep Creek, which itself is a tributary of the Youghiogheny River. And sometimes small dams are used to create farm ponds or ponds for parks and golf courses. Until recently, dams were built routinely, but now people are realizing that they have consequences. And for instance, in China, they're proposing a dam on the upper Mekong River, but it's being fought by countries downstream. And in the United States, we've occasionally started removing dams that are no longer needed, being used for any purpose, to improve the river's ability to sustain fish populations. And there have been several in the Patapsco, along the Patapsco, and this is the latest one, the Bloody Dam. This picture was taken in the summer of 2018, and this dam is now on. So rivers are also used for recreation, such as fishing. And this gentleman has caught a long-nosed gar in the Pocomoke River. The state helps fishermen out by stocking some rivers with hatchery-raised fish like brown trout. And brown trout can live in more polluted and less oxygenated water than brook trout. So they're much more common. And this is a picture of trout stocking by the Department of Natural Resources. They raise them in hatcheries and then they dump them in the rivers when they get to a certain size. The Department of Natural Resources is also trying to promote boating on the state's rivers, canoeing, kayaking, sailing, and motorboating. And they have created this water trails program. An official water trail, DNR, is a route along a waterway with public access points, and it has also reviewed and approved by a section of DNR called boating services. So for all the water trails, there are guidebooks like this one, and they include maps, information about access points, and so on. And if you go on the DNR website, look for the water trails page, you can find out which streams have water trails and how you can get the guidebooks. The state also has state parks along the rivers. This is someone fishing on the upper Patuxent. The Patuxent State Park is 6,700 acres along 12 miles on the upper Patuxent River. This is mostly undeveloped land used for fishing, hunting, biking, and horseback riding. But we also have Gunpowder Falls State Park, which is 18,000 acres, and Patapsco State Park, which is 16,000 acres and follows 32 miles of the river. And this is the busiest state park in Maryland. Parks are also beautiful scenery. And I just like this picture. This is Wilson's Bridge on the Conococheague Creek, which is a tributary of the Potomac. And this is near Hagerstown. So now let's look at one of the more problematic uses of we have put rivers to, disposing of wastes. This is the Back River wastewater treatment plant. It's on the Back River in Baltimore County. And what they call the golden eggs in the picture are devices that process sewage into sludge at the treatment plant. This is one of two plants that serve Baltimore City and the urbanized areas of Baltimore County adjoining the city. And when we talk about the rivers around Baltimore, we'll take a more detailed look at Back River. I'm going to stop here. Mary Lee, any questions?
No questions. No, we're
Okay.
good.
So until the middle of the 20th century, we didn't pay much attention to water pollution. But now improving water quality is a function of both the federal government, state government, and local governments. So there are two main types of water pollution: point source and non-point source. So point source pollution comes, among other things, from treatment plants like the one you see in the picture. After the treatment, they discharge what's left. It's cleaner water, but it's not completely clean. And there are still places where towns discharge raw sewage directly into rivers, but it all comes out at one point. And similarly, industrial waste from factories and industrial plants would be considered point source pollution. And of course, that's easier to treat because it's all coming from one place. You just have to put in the technology to do it. Non-point source pollution usually results from runoff from rainstorms. One type is sediment from construction sites, and you can see how easy it is for a good rainstorm to wash all this loose dirt down to the nearest stream. And the device along the bottom of the picture, the black thing here, is called a silt fence, and it is supposed to trap the water running off. And it mostly does, but it's not 100% effective usually. And of course, the other urban source of runoff is from streets and parking lots during rainstorms. And that washes off whatever is on the pavement, which could be gasoline or, well, I'll leave it to your imagination what could be there. Also, a type of non-point source pollution is agricultural runoff from fields. And non-point source pollution is harder to deal with because it comes from so many different sources and locations. Well, we now have some state and federal regulations, as well as non-governmental organizations that monitor water quality, do stream cleanups, and lobby for governmental action. At the federal level, the primary responsibility for clean water is under the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The Clean Water Act of 1972 sets standards for waste emissions from factories and effluent from wastewater treatment plants. In other words, point source pollution. At the state level, the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE, is the state's counterpart of the EPA, and they enforce state environmental regulations. So one way of dealing with non-point source pollution is by creating buffer areas that can absorb water absorb runoff before it enters the water. In 1984, Maryland adopted what are known as the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Regulations. And critical areas were defined as all land within 1,000 feet of high tide along the bay and its tidal waters, which includes all rivers and inlets that drain to the Chesapeake. For the first 100 to 300 feet off the high tide line, there is supposed to be no development or minimal development. Although there were a lot of requests at the time to grandfather in existing development, and there were also procedures for granting variances from the regulations. In the regulated area beyond this buffer, up to 1,000 feet from high tide, from the high tide line, there are standards in place for development density and also water quality. So that's helped somewhat with the lands right around the bay. Another method of controlling non-point source pollution are stormwater management ponds, and you've probably seen these around. Both during construction sites are required to have them, and also permanent ponds for after the construction is finished. So this is a place where stormwater can run off and the pollutants and solids can settle out before the water goes from the pond to some other place. And it has to do with how the pond is designed. And Maryland has had regulations for both these types of ponds, the construction and permanent ponds, since the 1980s. And there are now thousands of these ponds in place across the state. And while we're discussing non-point source pollution, we of course have to mention Mr. Trash Wheel. I don't know if any of you have met this gentleman. They have created this amazing device and anthropomorphized him, calling him Mr. Trash Wheel. And he has a whole fan club. He's been here at the mouth of the Jones Falls since 2014, and he has picked up estimated approximately 1,200 tons of trash since being installed. He has solar panels that power a wheel that collects the trash that flows down with the current. Anything that's dropped into the Jones Falls ends up in his mouth. And it goes into a collection point that's then taken away and disposed of. And he was such a success that there are now 4 of these around the harbor. Professor Trash Wheel, Captain Trash Wheel, and the latest one, they had a naming contest for this one at the mouth of the Gwynns Falls, and the winner was Gwynda, the Good Wheel of the West. And if you want to read more about Mr. Trash Wheel, he has his own website. Another program around efforts to clean up the Chesapeake is a federal initiative requiring all Maryland counties and Baltimore City to prepare plans to show how they're going to reduce nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, which are 3 critical elements in water pollution. And there is a plan. It was released in August of 2019. It's 64 pages long with 142 pages of appendix material. And I confess that I have not read it. But you are welcome to look it up. The actual title is Maryland's Phase 3 Watershed Implementation Plan to Restore Chesapeake Bay by 2025. Well, that's not very far away at this point, so. And I will leave you on this subject with a quote from the policy director of the Chester River Association. Getting the actual plans together, while it seems really daunting, is actually very doable. Once you figure out what's coming from each source and how much you need to reduce, you can create ways to do it. The problem is implementation. It's really about who is going to do this, how we're going to pay for it, and is everyone going to be willing to participate? So now we're going to go on to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. This is a federal act to designate certain rivers eligible for special protection. And basically what this says is rivers that meet these criteria, remarkable scenic, recreational, et cetera, values, shall be preserved in free-flowing condition. In other words, dams may not be built on these rivers. And here is an interesting statistic that puts this in perspective. The Wild and Scenic River System has about 0.25% of the nation's river miles, but about 17% of the nation's river miles already have large dams. So this is a very small percentage of rivers, but it's something. None of these rivers are in Maryland. Presumably none of the rivers in Maryland met the criteria. But in the same year, 1968, the General Assembly adopted the Maryland Scenic and Wild Rivers Act. All right. And what they came up with after assessing rivers and getting input from the local governments were mostly scenic rivers, a free-flowing river whose shoreline and related lands are predominantly forested, agricultural, grassland, marshland, or swampland, with a minimum of development for at least 2 miles of the river length. So there are a few around Maryland. You can see the list here and you can see where they are on the map. And only one river, and not even the whole river, qualified as wild according to the material, according to the standards. And it is a small part of the Youghiogheny River, this hatched area up in Garrett County. And this is a picture of one of Maryland's scenic rivers. This is the Monocacy, which is here, flows all the way through Frederick into the Potomac. And I agree, it is a very beautiful river. So in addition to government regulations and enforcements, we have citizen and non-governmental organizations that are interested in rivers. And I'd like to start by talking about the Bernie Fowler Wade-In. I don't know if you've heard of this, but Bernie Fowler was a state senator during the 1980s and 90s. He grew up near the Patuxent, and he remembered that he could stand chest deep in the river and was able to see his feet on the river bottom while he was netting for blue crabs. In 1988, when he was still a senator, he led the first wade-in to see if he could still see his feet while wading into the river. And he was disappointed to see that his white sneakers disappeared from view in just 10 inches of water. So now the Bernie Fowler Wade-In is an annual event that takes place in June. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about the Patuxent. And they measure what they call the sneaker index. And it has gotten better since 1988, but it has ways to go. So there are a number of nonprofit citizens organizations in Maryland and also across the country where people want to help protect the rivers where they live. And this is a picture of one of them in our area. They took a group portrait of the Gunpowder Valley Conservancy. A water conservancy is a group of mostly volunteers that does cleanups and other work, tree planting and similar work in an entire watershed. And of course, a watershed is, all the land that runs off into the river. So this is to protect the Gunpowder River. Another kind of organization are called river keepers. River keepers started back in the 1960s. A fishermen's association on the Hudson River was concerned about pollution in the river and how it was impacting the fish population. In 1983, the association morphed into the Hudson River Keeper, and it had Robert Kennedy Jr. as its prosecuting attorney. The idea has since spread to other states and countries, and many riverkeeper organizations are now part of an international organization called the Waterkeeper Alliance. So sometimes they're harbor keepers or bay keepers. They've expanded just beyond rivers. But a riverkeeper is someone whose full-time job is essentially to protect a particular river and to serve as its public advocate and to educate people about preserving it and using it. The Riverkeeper website says their working equipment usually includes a boat, a pair of hip boots, and sometimes a law degree. They monitor water quality, which is probably what people are doing in this picture. And they keep an eye on what's happening in and on the river. And they'll take polluters to court if necessary. And they usually work with volunteers. So Maryland currently has 14 river keepers, which seems like a good number for a state our size. And they are the Eastern Shore. On the Eastern Shore, they are the Chester, the Choptank, the Miles and Wye, that's one, the Sassafras, and one called the Assateague Coast Keepers. In Southern Maryland, we have river keepers on the Anacostia, the Patuxent, the Severn, the South River, and the Weston Road, and that's also one group of keepers. And in Central Maryland, we have the Gunpowder, the Potomac, and the Baltimore Harbor Keeper. And the Baltimore Harbor Keeper is part of an umbrella organization called Blue Water Baltimore. And we'll talk about Blue Water Baltimore when we talk about Baltimore, but it was, there were several different river associations in the Baltimore area, and they decided to merge and create one group called Blue Water Baltimore. So here we are, Maryland's creeks and rivers. And as I said, next week we'll be looking at the Eastern Shore rivers, which are everything on the eastern side of the Chesapeake. And then we'll be looking at the Baltimore area, and then the Patuxent and Patapsco. This is the Patuxent, the Patapsco. The Patapsco is part of the Baltimore story, but it's such a big and important river that it also gets its own week, its own discussion. And again, the Potomac and the Susquehanna. And interestingly, the Potomac is the longest river, but not the longest river entirely in Maryland, because it's the border with Maryland and Virginia and West Virginia. And the Susquehanna, which only a tiny little piece is in Maryland, but as we'll see, it's very important. So I'm going to end with a quote that I found I really like from Charles Kuralt. And he said, he had a program traveling around the country, talking about the country. I started out thinking of America as highways and state lines. As I got to know it better, I began to think of it as rivers. Most of what I love about the country is a gift of the rivers. America is a great story, and there is a river on every page of it. Any other questions, Mary Lee?
Yes, there's one, let's see. Oh, no, actually, there's two. One from Jim, is heated water such as that discharged by power plants and factories considered pollution?
I would have to say it is, because obviously it changes the temperature of the water, and that affects whatever lives in the river. It probably decreases the dissolved oxygen, just I would guess from how it works. But I will also look that up and see if I can give you a more detailed answer about that. That's a very
Okay.
good question.
And there's one more. This is from Gat. Would you classify a failing septic system as point source or no point source pollution?
You see that happening in houses along Chesapeake Bay, these old
Yeah.
houses with bad septic systems.
Well, it's in some sense it's both,
Right.
but because you can actually deal with it at the source,
Right.
you can treat it as point source pollution. And I would assume that the counties where these septic systems are failing are making people do something about it. I don't know. Do you know more about that?
Well, only that they're subject to regulation, that's for sure, right?
Yeah, right. I think it was something about helping people to do that. Was some kind of funding program or something? I'll
You
have
can
to
certainly
look.
smell it when you're going kayaking up a little creek,
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Well, that's very unpleasant.
Federal MS4 program also addresses it, especially where there's combined septic and stormwater sewage
Oh,
system.
yeah, right. Well, sewage and storm, that's been a major problem. The very earliest sewage systems had stormwater runoff and sewage, and that's as opposed to isolating, the sewage from, your house, and not allowing stormwater to run into it. And that's been a major problem in some places. So, yeah.
And in rural areas, there's still a fair number of wildcat septic systems, which is otherwise known as dumping your toilet in the creek.
Wildcat septic system. That's interesting.
Basically, you're just piping it directly into the creek.
Right. I'm guessing the Baltimore area probably doesn't have those, but
No, it tends to be out in the mountainous and rural areas.
yeah. Okay, well, we're done if nobody has any more questions. And next
There are
week,
hands up.
oh, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
And my hand's up too. So
Okay, two more questions.
Let's see that. Okay.
who's going to talk?
I think Tim said first.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead. I don't know what happened.
No, I just mentioned that there were hands up. They weren't noted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Sue.
Okay. So I've always been with RI since I've been here for 6 years or 5. And that was my mom was part of RI. But last semester I looked at Odyssey just out of curiosity as comparing it to RI. And they had a class on why it's been so difficult for the Chesapeake to get cleaned up. And it was federal, state, local laws, and it was sounded like a really interesting course, and very much on why the Chesapeake is still at a C- or something for cleanliness.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, and the question is not just for you, Judy, but actually there's all these, like, what is it, 36 people participating here today. Was anybody in that class?
I was not.
Yeah, at Odyssey. I mean, I read it after the semester had happened. But it sounded like it was a lot of, about litigation. Okay, that's just my question.
Very complicated subject and a very
Hmm.
complicated problem. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds really sad, actually.
Well, they're working on it, but it's going to take a long time. Yeah.
Thank you.
And some of it is having the political will to do things.
Yeah.
And so there are three raised hands. Mary Lee, can you see who they are? I don't.
I can't see the raised hands. I
Okay.
can't see who it is. Yeah, I don't, and there's nothing else in chat. I
Mike
don't-
Baker has his hand up.
Who
I wish
does?
somebody can see it because I can't. Yeah.
I can't either.
They're the gold hands.
You see me waving here?
Go ahead.
A couple of things where you're, one of the things that I tied in with the fish and the pollution is that those trout kind of got wiped out in Garrett County.
The brook trout?
Those brook trout,
Yeah.
they kind of got wiped out in Garrett County because they did,
Oh, I don't.
so much of the strip mining for
Yeah,
coal.
but we'll talk about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
when we get to the Potomac River, there, I'll be talking about acid mine drainage. Yeah. But
Yeah.
they've also found ways of mitigating it.
Yeah, I know that they're making a bit of a comeback, and I remember when the first river keeper got established because it was a famous guy. It was Pete Seeger on
Oh,
the
yeah.
on the Hudson River, and that was a tie-in with a major lawsuit to General Electric that
Mhm.
was pumping exceptionally toxic waste
Yeah,
into the Hudson River. It was horrible.
yeah, we've come quite a ways since then.
Yeah.
Is there somebody else who had their hand up?
Yes, Judy, Tim does. One suggestion, I read a great book by Tom Pelton, who's a former Baltimore Sun environmental reporter, as well as he's the key environmental reporter with the Chesapeake Bay Trust. And he wrote a book called Treasure the Chesapeake, which I have lent out and have not gotten back. But but it is one of the best books about the Chesapeake Bay, and it's fairly recent. I think he wrote it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, on the pollution and all of the political things concerning it over time. And he ends with a chapter that has stuck in my brain forever now, because I'm involved in environmental organizations, was that the only time the Chesapeake Bay has made any improvement has been when a law has been passed, and preferably at the federal level, not the state level, and has had the EPA come in and enforce the law. And then citizens like river keepers and gunpowder conservancy citizens go and make sure the enforcement is correct, like source pollution as an example. So it really drove home the idea that you have to have political will and teeth in it. And he gives numerous examples of where these associations, there's a big one in among the states, I forget what it's called. It's been around for a while and is highly touted as being an effective way of dealing with these kind of complex issues. And it is nothing but nothing but failure over the last 30 years that it's been in existence. It's this idea of cooperativeness among polluters and citizens, but you can never get them. It's kind of like herding cats. You can never get them all together to agree on very specific actions.
Yeah, good luck in getting Pennsylvania to help out.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. And we're talking about the bay, half of the water comes from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Anyway, anybody else? Any other raised hands before we get off?
Yeah, it's 10:52, Judy.
Okay. Well, people are welcome to leave whenever they want, but if people have questions. Okay, I think we should
Thank you.
let everybody go and get ready for your next class, including me.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Judy.
Wonderful
Judy.
class.
Wonderful
Thanks.
class.
Thank you.